Gunsmoke was the devil's own incense, a foul sacrament for the god of greed. It clung to the air in Dust Devil Creek, thick and acrid, burning the eyes and scraping the throat. Elias Thorne tasted it on his tongue, a bitter mix of sulfur and terror. He wasn't wearing a star anymore. The silver badge that had once been a part of him now rested in a dusty box beneath his bed, a relic of a life that had burned down 5 years ago, leaving nothing but ash and memory. Now he was just a blacksmith, a man whose world had shrunk to the rhythmic clang of a hammer on hot steel. But the past had a way of refusing its grave. The chaos had erupted with the sudden violence of a summer storm. One moment, the main street was a sleepy river of dust and commerce. The next, it was a battlefield. 4 riders, their faces masked by bandanas, had descended upon the first bank of Dust Devil Creek with practiced brutality. Gunshots cracked, echoing off the false-fronted buildings. Glass shattered, spraying onto the boardwalk like crystallized fear. People screamed, a raw, ragged chorus of panic as they scattered like quail. Elias had been heading toward the mercantile, his mind on the price of coal, not on heroism. His instincts, however, were older and sharper than his grief. When a stray bullet splintered the post of the dressmaker's awning, sending a shower of wood down on a little girl frozen in terror, he moved. He didn't think. He reacted. He lunged forward, a blur of motion honed by years of facing down men with nothing to lose. He grabbed the child, a bundle of gingham and fear, and shoved her behind a stack of barrels just as another shot gouged a furrow in the dirt where she'd been standing. "Stay down," he rasped, his voice a stranger to him, a ghost of the marshal he once was. From his crouched position, he watched the robbery unfold with a detached professional eye. The outlaws were good. Too good. They moved with a chilling efficiency, 2 inside 2 providing cover fire on the street. Their leader stood on the bank steps, a tall, commanding figure in a long duster. He wasn't frantic or hurried. He radiated a predatory calm, directing the chaos with subtle hand gestures, as if conducting an orchestra of violence. The bank doors burst open. The 2 inside men emerged, dragging heavy sacks. The leader gave a final sweeping glance over the street, his eyes lingering for a moment on the barrels where Elias was hidden. It was a look of cold amusement, as if he knew someone with a spine was watching. As he turned to mount his horse, something silver slipped from his coat and fell to the dusty boardwalk with a soft clink unnoticed. The gang spurred their horses, thundering out of town in a cloud of dust and stolen dreams, leaving behind a shattered afternoon and the metallic scent of blood. The townspeople began to emerge slowly, cautiously, their faces pale. Sheriff Miller, young Ernest, and perpetually overwhelmed, rushed toward the bank, shouting orders that no one was quite ready to follow. Elias ignored him. His gaze was fixed on the small silver object glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. He rose slowly, his joints aching, and walked toward it. The little girl he'd saved was already being swept into the arms of her weeping mother. No one was paying him any mind. He was just the town blacksmith, a quiet man who kept to himself. He knelt, his calloused fingers closing around the object. It was a locket intricately carved with the image of a single desert rose. It was warm from the sun, heavy in his palm. His breath caught in his throat, a painful tearing sound. A cold dread far sharper than the fear of any bullet tightened in his gut, pulling the air from his lungs. He knew this locket. He had commissioned it himself from a silversmith in Santa Fe. He had traced the delicate petals with his own thumb before placing it in a velvet-lined box. He had fastened it around his wife's neck on their first anniversary. Sarah. He fumbled with the clasp, his thumb slipping twice before it finally clicked open. Inside were the 2 tiny, faded portraits. On the left, a younger Elias, his face unlined, smiling with an ease he could no longer remember. On the right, Sarah. Her hair was the color of autumn honey, and her eyes held a light that could have outshone the sun. She was smiling, a look of pure, unguarded love aimed directly at him. The world tilted. The sounds of the street, the shouting, the crying, the sheriff's blustering faded into a distant roar. He was back in the cold, hard earth of the churchyard, and the scent of freshly turned soil thick in his nostrils. He remembered placing this very locket into Sarah's still hands before they closed the coffin lid. He had buried it with her. It was supposed to be with her safe in the quiet dark. How did this killer, this butcher, have his dead wife's locket? The question was not a thought. It was a physical blow, a shard of ice piercing his soul. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed, the fragile peace he had built upon a foundation of grief and solitude, shattered into a million pieces. The ghost of Marshal Elias Thorne, the man he thought he had buried alongside his wife, clawed its way back to the surface. He closed the locket, and the metal biting into his palm. His knuckles were white. The trail of Silas Kane and his gang was no longer just a matter for the law. It was a reckoning. And Elias Thorne would see it through to its bitter, bloody end. The trail to Dust Devil Creek was a scar etched into the alkali flats where the sun beat down until the air shimmered like liquid glass, and the only shade came from the buzzards circling overhead. It was a town born of silver and sin, a magnet for prospectors, gamblers, and men running from their own shadows. Elias had come here to disappear, to lose himself in the anonymity of the forge. For 5 years it had worked. Now the town felt like a cage. He spent the night after the robbery in his forge, the heat of the fire, a poor substitute for the cold that had settled deep in his bones. He didn't sleep. He held the locket, turning it over and over in his hands. The smooth, cool metal, a tangible link to an impossible reality. Every detail of Sarah's death replayed in his mind. A tragic accident, they had called it. A runaway carriage on the road from the city. A terrible, senseless loss. He had accepted it, swallowed the bitter pill of fate, because the alternative, that something more sinister was at play, was too monstrous to contemplate. Until now. The next morning, the sun rose on a town buzzing with fear and speculation. Sheriff Miller, his face drawn and weary, was trying to organize a posse. He was a good man, but he was a boy playing a man's game, elected because no one else wanted the job. When he saw Elias step out of the forge, his eyes lit with a desperate hope. Elias, he began hurrying over. I was just about to come see you. I need your help. You were a marshal. You know how to handle men like this. Elias looked at the handful of volunteers Miller had assembled, a nervous-looking store clerk, a grizzled old prospector, and 2 farmhands who looked barely old enough to shave. It wasn't a posse. It was a collection of lambs for the slaughter. This isn't my fight, Miller. Elias said, his voice flat. It was a lie, and it tasted like ash. Nar, the hell it isn't. They shot old man Hemlock in the leg. They could have killed that little girl. This is everyone's fight. Miller insisted, his youthful idealism clashing with Elias's bone-deep cynicism. They're long gone, Elias said, turning away. You'll just be chasing ghosts. He needed to think, to work this puzzle alone. Bringing Miller and his amateurs into it would only get them killed. He retreated into the dim quiet of the forge, but the sheriff followed his footsteps, dogged. What's that you've got there? Miller asked, his eyes catching the glint of silver in Elias's hand. Elias closed his fist around the locket. Nothing. But Miller had seen it. He was young, but he wasn't a fool. You found that after the robbery, didn't you? It's evidence. You have to turn it over. Elias fixed him with a look so cold and hard it made the young sheriff take a step back. "This is personal. Stay out of it." His path was clear, but it was a path he had to walk alone. First, he needed information. He needed to know the name of the man who had dropped the locket. He made his way to the saloon, the Gilded Cage, a place he normally avoided. It was early, but the establishment was already doing a brisk trade in whiskey and rumors. At the far end of the bar, polishing a glass with a practiced hand, was Isabella. Isabella ran the Gilded Cage with an iron will and a sharp tongue. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, and her eyes missed nothing. She was the town's unofficial historian and keeper of secrets, a moral compass, in a place that had long ago lost its direction. She and Elias shared a quiet understanding, two solitary souls who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Thorne," she said without looking up as he approached the bar. "I might have," he replied, his voice low. He slid a coin across the polished wood. "The man who led the robbery. You hear a name?" Isabella stopped polishing and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were dark and perceptive. "Whiskey first. You look like you need it." She poured him a shot, her movements economical. "The name floating on the whiskey wind is Silas Kane. A new player, not some common road agent. They say he's smart, eloquent even, and as ruthless as a starving wolf." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is who he's hitting." The bank. Elias stated the answer obvious. "No," she corrected, tapping a long finger on the bar for emphasis. The bank was just a message. The money in that vault was an investment from the Silver Ridge Mining Company, Judge Abernathy's company. Judge Abernathy, the most powerful man in the territory. He, along with Elias's own late father, Jedediah Thorne, had founded Dust Devil Creek. They had built the town from nothing, or so the story went. 2 weeks ago, Isabella continued, a freight wagon carrying refined silver ore was hit. Also belonged to the Silver Ridge Mining Company. A month before that, a payroll was stolen. Same company. Kane isn't just robbing. He's systematically dismantling Judge Abernathy's empire, piece by piece. The information settled in Elias's gut like a lead weight. This wasn't random. It was targeted. A war was being waged against the town's foundation, and for some reason, the leader of this war had his dead wife's locket. The coincidence was too great, the connection too chilling. Why, Elias asked more to himself than to Isabella. "That's the $50 question, isn't it?" she said, turning back to her glasses. "Abernathy's got more enemies than a dog has fleas. But this feels different. This feels personal. Like Kane isn't after money. He's after a pound of flesh." She paused and then looked at him again, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "There are old ghosts in this town, Elias. Some are best left undisturbed." He downed the whiskey in one swallow, the burn in his throat doing little to quell the fire in his soul. He now had a name and a pattern. Silas Kane, a methodical man with a vendetta against Judge Abernathy. And somehow, Sarah was tangled in this web of secrets and revenge. He left the saloon and walked to the one place he had avoided for 5 years, at the imposing stone house on the hill where Judge Abernathy lived. It was time to disturb the ghosts. Judge Abernathy's house was a monument to wealth and power, a 2-story stone fortress that loomed over the dusty shacks of Dust Devil Creek. It was built to intimidate, to declare that its owner was a man, apart from the common grit and struggle of the frontier. Elias remembered playing in its shadow as a boy, when his father Jedediah and Abernathy were inseparable partners carving an empire out of the wilderness. He was met at the door by a grim-faced butler who looked him up and down with disapproval, his gaze lingering on the coal dust under Elias's fingernails. "The judge is not seeing anyone." "Tell him it's Elias Thorne." Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's about the robbery." The butler reluctantly showed him into a study lined with leather-bound books that had never been read. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and self-importance. Judge Abernathy sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had aged the lines of ambition on his face, deepening into grooves of avarice. "Elias," the judge boomed, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A stranger in my own home. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to offer your condolences for my financial inconvenience." "I came to ask about Silas Kane," Elias said, cutting through the pleasantries. The judge's smile tightened. "A common thief. The law will handle him. Young Miller seems to think he's capable." The dismissal was clear. "He's not a common thief." Elias pressed, stepping closer to the desk. "He's targeting you specifically. Isabella at the saloon says this is the third major hit on your assets in 2 months. A man doesn't go to that much trouble over a simple grudge." Abernathy leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers over his ample stomach. "Business is a battlefield, my boy. One makes enemies. This Kane is just a more ambitious sort of vermin. He'll be exterminated in due time." Elias felt a surge of frustration. The judge was stonewalling him, hiding behind a wall of arrogance. He decided to force the issue. He placed the silver locket on the desk, right in the center of a stack of legal documents. It lay there on the polished wood, a small, intricate accusation. "His leader dropped this during the robbery." Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It was my wife's. I buried it with her." For the first time, a genuine emotion flickered across Abernathy's face. Not surprise, not sympathy, but a flash of pure, unadulterated fear. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a mask of practiced concern. "My God, Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That's impossible. A grave robber, the fiend, to desecrate a resting place. It's unthinkable." But the lie was in his eyes. Elias had seen that look before, in the eyes of men trying to talk their way out of a noose. The judge knew more than he was letting on. "Was Sarah involved in your business, Judge?" Elias asked, his gaze locked on the older man's. "Did she know something about your dealings? Something that might have gotten her killed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Abernathy's face purpled with indignation. "How dare you?" he sputtered, rising from his chair. "You come into my home, the home of your father's oldest friend, and you levy such a vile accusation. Sarah's death was a tragic accident. Your grief has clearly unhinged you." "My grief has made me patient." Elias countered, his voice like flint. "But my patience is wearing thin. What aren't you telling me?" "Get out!" Abernathy snarled, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. "Get out of my house before I have the sheriff arrest you for harassment." Elias stared at him for a long moment, the truth of the situation solidifying in his mind. The judge was terrified. Silas Kane. Sarah's locket, his father's memory, they were all threads of the same tangled knot. Abernathy was at the center of it, and he would rather see Elias hang than admit what he knew. Without another word, Elias picked up the locket and walked out, leaving the judge sputtering in impotent fury. The visit had given him no answers, but it had given him something just as valuable: confirmation. He was on the right path. The secrets of this town were buried deep, and he would have to dig them up, even if it meant destroying the legacy of his own father to do it. He went to the one place left where his father's secrets might still reside, the old Thorne homestead, abandoned since his father's death a year after Sarah's. It was a place of ghosts and painful memories, a place he hadn't set foot in for 4 years. The house stood on a rise overlooking the town, a silent, weathered monument to a past built on lies. He pushed open the creaking door, stepping into a world layered with dust and the scent of decay. He made his way to his father's study, a room almost identical to the judge's, filled with the same trappings of unearned authority. He began to search methodically, desperately. He rifled through drawers filled with old business ledgers and yellowed correspondence. It was hours of painstaking work, a journey through his father's life, that revealed only the meticulous records of a shrewd and ruthless businessman. He found nothing. Defeated, he slumped into his father's old leather chair. The springs groaned in protest. As he leaned back, his hand brushed against the underside of the massive oak desk. He felt a small, unnatural indentation in the wood. A hidden catch. His heart quickened. He pressed it, and with a soft click, a false panel in the side of the desk sprang open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single thin leather-bound journal. He opened it. The handwriting was his father's, but the neat, precise script of his business ledgers was replaced by a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. He began to read, and the carefully constructed world of his past began to crumble into dust. The journal told a story that began 20 years ago. It spoke of a parcel of land, a hidden canyon sacred to a local tribe and home to a peaceful Mexican family named Sandoval. The journal described in chillingly practical terms how Jedediah Thorne and Judge Abernathy had discovered a massive vein of silver on that land. The Sandovals refused to sell. So Jedediah and Abernathy took it. The journal didn't use the word massacre. It used phrases like clearing the title and removing squatters. But the implication was clear. They had hired guns, descended on the Sandoval homestead in the dead of night, and slaughtered them. Men, women, children. An entire family erased from the earth to pave the way for the Silver Ridge Mine and the founding of Dust Devil Creek. Elias felt sick. His father, the man he had revered, was a murderer. The town he grew up in was built on a foundation of blood and bone. He read on his hands, shaking. The final entries were from 5 years ago, just before Sarah's death. October 12th S. Grows suspicious. She has been asking questions about the old Sandoval deed. She has a righteous streak that will be the death of us. I told her some things are best left in the past. October 14th. She found it. The original deed, hidden in the safe. She confronted me, called me a monster, threatened to expose everything to tell Elias. Said she couldn't live with a lie, couldn't raise a family on blood money. The fool. She has sealed her own fate. The next entry was a single chilling sentence. October 16th. The carriage accident has been arranged. A tragic loss for our dear Elias. It is better this way. The secret is safe. Elias dropped the journal. The room spun. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. His own father had murdered his wife to protect a secret. The locket, Jedediah must have taken it from her body as a final cruel trophy before casting her into the staged wreck. And Silas Kane, he had to be a Sandoval. The sole survivor of the massacre returned to exact a methodical, righteous vengeance upon the men who had destroyed his family. He wasn't a villain. He was a ghost, an agent of a justice long denied. The weight of the truth was suffocating. His entire life was a lie. His grief for his wife was now intertwined with the horror of his father's betrayal. His quest for answers had led him to a truth so monstrous it threatened to destroy him. But amidst the wreckage of his soul, one thing was clear. This was no longer about his own personal revenge. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. It was about justice. Not the kind that came from a badge or a courtroom, but a deeper, more profound justice for the Sandoval family and for the woman he had loved. He now knew who his enemy was, but he also knew who his ally had to be: Silas Kane. He had to find him, not to fight him, but to stand with him. The hunt for Silas Kane began not with a gun, but with a map. Elias spread out an old territorial survey on the dusty floor of his father's study, the damning journal lying open beside it. The entry about the massacre mentioned a hidden canyon, a place sacred to the Sandoval family. It was his only lead. Cross-referencing his father's notes with the survey, he found it a remote, almost inaccessible chasm in the Dragoon Mountains, marked on the map only as Black Creek Basin. It was a place the law would never look a perfect hideout for a ghost. Before he left, he went to see Isabella. He needed supplies, and more than that, he needed to trust someone with a piece of the truth. He found her in the early morning quiet of the saloon, wiping down tables. He laid his father's journal on the bar. "Read it," he said. She looked from the book to his face, saw the profound, harrowing change in his eyes, and began to read. She read in silence, her expression hardening from curiosity to disbelief and finally to a weary, cynical sorrow. When she finished, she closed the book gently. "I told you this town had ghosts, Thorne," she whispered. "I just never knew they were yours." "I'm going after him," Elias said. "Kane, I need to find him." "To kill him." "To help him," Elias corrected. The words felt strange on his tongue, a reversal of every instinct he'd ever had as a lawman. "My father Abernathy. They owe a debt. It's time it was paid." Isabella nodded slowly, a deep understanding in her eyes. She packed him a satchel with dried jerky hardtack and a canteen of water, adding a bottle of her best whiskey. "For the cold nights," she said. "Elias, be careful. Justice and revenge are two horses that are damn hard to tell apart in the dark." The journey to the Dragoon Mountains was a crucible. The desert was a harsh and honest place, just as the Apache warrior in the original story had said. It stripped away a man's pretenses, leaving only what was essential. For 3 days, Elias rode the sun beating down the nights, filled with a profound and lonely silence. He was no longer just a blacksmith in mourning. He was a man adrift, his past, a ruin, his future, an unwritten page. He felt the weight of his father's sins on his shoulders, a heavier burden than any pack. He slept with fragmented nightmares, the scream of twisting metal from a carriage wreck, the phantom smell of smoke from a fire. He couldn't quite remember from his childhood a woman's voice calling his name, Sarah's voice. He found the entrance to Black Creek Basin on the 4th day. It was a narrow fissure in a sheer rock wall, almost completely obscured by a thick growth of mesquite and scrub oak. It was a place designed to remain hidden. He dismounted, leading his horse through the tight passage. The air grew cooler, the oppressive heat of the desert giving way to a shaded stillness. The passage opened into a breathtaking sight. It was a hidden world, a lush canyon oasis, with a clear stream running through its center lined with cottonwood trees. A dozen men were camped there, Silas Kane's men, But they were not the swaggering, bloodthirsty outlaws of popular imagination. They were a quiet, disciplined group of vaqueros and displaced nativesmen who had been wronged by the tide of American expansion, united by a common cause. They had seen him long before he saw them. Two men with rifles stepped out from the rocks, their faces hard, their eyes wary. "That's far enough," one of them called out in Spanish. Elias raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "I'm here to see Silas Kane. My name is Elias Thorne." The name caused a stir. They knew who he was. The son of Jedediah Thorne. One of the riflemen spat on the ground. "We have nothing to say to a Thorne." "Tell him I know about the Sandovals." Elias said, his voice carrying through the canyon. "Tell him I have my father's journal." The tension ratcheted up. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Before they could decide whether to shoot him or hear him out, a voice cut through the air, calm and cultured. "Let him pass, Ricardo." Silas Kane emerged from the shadow of an overhang. He was not wearing a bandana now. His face was striking with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that held a deep, lingering sadness beneath their steely resolve. He moved with a natural grace, an aristocrat's bearing that seemed utterly at odds with his reputation as a wanted outlaw. He looked at Elias not with hatred, but with a kind of weary curiosity. Elias Thorne. Kane said, his English perfect accented only by a soft musical lilt. "I must confess, you are the last man I ever expected to see in my home. To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "At your home?" Elias asked, gesturing to the canyon. "It was," Kane replied, a shadow passing over his face. "This was my grandfather's land, my family's land, before your father and Judge Abernathy decided they had a greater claim to it." He gestured for Elias to follow him toward a small campfire. "You mentioned a journal." Elias handed it to him. Kane took it, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover as if it were a venomous snake. He began to read. As he did, his calm facade crumbled. The story of his family's murder, written in the cold, detached hand of one of the architects of that horror, brought a raw, naked pain to his face. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He was not a monster. He was a son, a brother, a man mourning a world that had been stolen from him. When he looked up, his eyes were burning with a righteous fire. "And the locket?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you know?" "My father's journal." Elias explained, his own voice hoarse. He took it from her after he had her killed. She had discovered the truth and was going to expose him. The revelation struck Kane with visible force. He looked at Elias and for the first time saw not the son of his enemy, but a fellow victim, another man whose life had been shattered by the same lie. "So," Kane said softly, "we are both ghosts, haunted by the same men." "They built their fortunes on the graves of your family and the woman I loved," Elias said. "Abernathy is still alive. He needs to answer for what he's done." "He will," Kane vowed. "My work is not finished. I have bled his finances. I have made him afraid. But the final act requires a more personal touch. I mean to strip him of everything, not just his money, but his reputation, his power. I will expose him for the butcher he is." "Let me help you," Elias offered. "This is my fight too, for Sarah, for the truth." Kane studied him for a long moment, the leader assessing a potential recruit, the survivor judging the heart of his enemy's son. My campaign has been one of stealth and precision, he said. Vengeance is a dish best served cold, Mr. Thorne. But the time for subtlety is almost over. Abernathy is cornered. He's moving the last of his personal bullion from the mine's central vault. He plans to flee the territory. He's paranoid. He's hired a small army of Pinkerton agents to guard the transfer. The final confrontation will be at the old Mission San Xavier, halfway between here and the railhead. That is where I will take my final payment. When? Tomorrow night. During the storm that is brewing. It will provide the perfect cover. He stood his decision made. Very well, Mr. Thorne. You wish to help, you can ride with us. You can bear witness. But understand this, Abernathy is mine. As dusk fell over the canyon, Deputy Miller rode in, not as a prisoner, but as a willing participant. He had followed Elias, his instincts telling him the truth of the robbery was far more complex than a simple raid. Elias had intercepted him on the trail, and after seeing the journal, Miller's loyalty to the town's corrupt leadership had shattered. He was young, but his moral compass was true. The law I swore to uphold was a lie. He'd said to Elias, his face pale but resolute, I'll stand with the real law now. The three of them, the grieving lawman, the righteous avenger, and the disillusioned deputy, sat by the fire as the wind began to howl through the canyon, a prelude to the coming storm. They were an unlikely alliance, bound by a terrible truth. Tomorrow night, in the ruins of an old Spanish mission, they would not just be fighting for gold or revenge. They would be fighting for the soul of a town built on a lie, and for the ghosts who demanded a final terrible justice. The Mission San Xavier was a skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. Its adobe walls, once a symbol of faith on the unforgiving frontier, were now crumbling to dust. The bell tower stood like a lone, crooked finger pointing toward a bruised and turbulent sky. A thunderstorm born in the distant mountains was rolling across the plains, and the wind moaned through the mission's empty archways like a choir of lost souls. It was a Gothic stage perfectly set for a final act of retribution. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, momentary flash. Inside the mission courtyard, a dozen grim-faced Pinkerton agents, rifles at the ready, stood guard around a heavy iron strongbox. Judge Abernathy was there, his face slick with a mixture of rain and sweat, his eyes darting nervously into the surrounding darkness. He was a cornered animal, and he knew it. From a ridge overlooking the mission, Elias, Kane, and Miller watched their collars turned up against the driving rain. Kane's men had already moved into position, silent phantoms melting into the ruins. They're expecting a frontal assault. Kane set his voice a low murmur against the rising wind. They believe we are simple bandits. We will not be. The plan was elegant in its audacity. While Kane's men created a diversion at the main gate, Elias and Kane would slip in through the old catacombs that ran beneath the mission chapel. Miller, positioned on the ridge with a long-range rifle, would provide cover fire and watch for any attempt by Abernathy to escape. Remember? Kane set his dark eyes, locking onto Elias's. The gold means nothing. The confession is everything. The world must know what he did. The signal was a solitary hoot of an owl, barely audible over the storm. Instantly, gunfire erupted from the main gate. The Pinkertons reacted as expected, concentrating their fire on the diversion. Under the cover of the noise and confusion, Elias and Kane slipped down the ridge and pried open a heavy stone slab that concealed the entrance to the catacombs. The air below was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. They moved through the suffocating darkness, their path lit only by a single hooded lantern. The narrow passages were a maze, but Kane knew them intimately. This place had been a refuge for his ancestors long before the Spanish had come. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the distant gunshots sounded muted and strange, like a battle in another world. They emerged through a trap door behind the chapel's crumbling altar, stepping into the heart of the storm. The main courtyard was chaos. Kane's men, using the ruins for cover, were engaged in a fierce firefight with the Pinkertons. Lightning flashed again, and in its stark white glare, Elias saw Abernathy trying to make a break for it, dragging a single heavy saddlebag, using a young Pinkerton as a human shield. "He's running," Elias yelled over the thunder. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the din, the frantic clanging toll of the mission bell. A stray bullet, or perhaps a bolt of lightning, had struck the bell tower. The discordant, deafening sound disoriented everyone, friend and foe alike. In that moment of confusion, Kane broke from cover, moving with astonishing speed. He intercepted Abernathy, tackling him to the muddy ground. The saddlebag flew open, spilling not gold, but stacks of legal documents and deeds, the judge's entire ill-gotten empire on paper. The fight devolved into a brutal close-quarter struggle. But the Pinkertons were professionals. They quickly regrouped surrounding the chapel. The firefight had been a feint to draw them in. Elias and Kane were trapped. "It seems our luck has run out, Mr. Thorne," Kane said with a grim smile, reloading his revolver as they took cover behind the stone altar. Just then the chapel doors burst open. It was Abernathy, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He was holding a gun to Deputy Miller's head. The young lawman was pale, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. He'd been captured while trying to create a secondary diversion. "Drop your weapons," Abernathy screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Or the boy dies, I'll see you all in hell." The stakes had changed. It was no longer a battle. It was a standoff. Elias saw the dilemma in Kane's eyes. This was his one chance to get the man who had destroyed his family, but it would cost the life of an innocent. "Don't do it, Elias," Miller choked out. "Don't let him—" Abernathy slammed the pistol against Miller's temple, silencing him. "I said drop them." Elias looked at Kane. In that shared gaze, an understanding passed between them. They had come for justice, not for more bloodshed. Slowly, Kane placed his revolver on the ground. Elias did the same. Abernathy laughed a ragged, ugly sound. "Fools, you sentimental fools." He shoved Miller forward, causing him to stumble to his knees. "You wanted a confession, Kane. You want the world to know. Fine. Yes, I did it, Jedediah and I. We cleared that land of your filthy family. We built a town out of nothing. We were pioneers. We did what had to be done." As he raved, a fire started by an overturned lantern during the earlier chaos began to lick its way up the dry timber supports of the old chapel roof. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. The ticking clock had returned. "And you," Abernathy spat, turning his wild eyes to Elias. "Your precious Sarah. She was just like you, a self-righteous fool. She was going to ruin everything. Your father was a great man, a practical man. He did what was necessary to protect our legacy. He took that pretty little locket from her neck himself, a reminder of what happens to people who stand in the way of progress." The confession was out raw and vile, hanging in the smoky air. And with it, Abernathy had sealed his own fate. He had given Kane the one thing he needed to hear. A look of profound, almost serene peace settled on Kane's face. He had his truth. In that moment, as Abernathy's attention was fixed on Elias, Kane moved. It wasn't the lightning-fast draw of a gunslinger, but the desperate lunge of a man with nothing left to lose. He threw himself not at Abernathy, but at Miller, pushing the young deputy out of the line of fire. Abernathy's gun roared. The bullet struck Kane square in the chest. Elias reacted a split second later. His hand blurred as he drew a small derringer hidden in his boot, a lawman's last resort he hadn't touched in 5 years. He fired once. The shot was perfect. Abernathy crumpled to the ground, his confession dying in his throat. The Pinkertons, their employer dead, lost their nerve. Seeing the fire spreading rapidly, they fled into the storm. Elias rushed to Kane's side. The wound was mortal. Kane lay on the stone floor, the rain washing over his face, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "Did you hear him, Thorne?" Kane whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He admitted it. "My family. They can rest now." "Oh, we did it, Silas." Elias said, his voice thick, gripping the dying man's shoulder. "The money. The recovered gold from the bank." Kane coughed, a fleck of blood on his lips. "Use it for them. The families. The ones your father and men like him ruined. Make it right." He reached into his coat and pulled out Sarah's locket. He pressed it into Elias's hand. "This belongs to you. A ghost. For a ghost." His eyes glazed over, staring up at the burning rafters as if seeing something far beyond them. With a final shuddering sigh, Silas Kane, the last of the Sandovals, was gone. Elias knelt there for a long moment, the heat from the fire growing more intense, the roar of the flames drowning out the thunder. He was surrounded by death and destruction. But for the first time in 5 years, the suffocating weight of the unknown had lifted. He had the truth. A terrible, soul-scorching truth, but the truth nonetheless. He helped the dazed and wounded Miller to his feet, and together they staggered out of the burning mission, leaving the bodies of the guilty to be consumed by the flames of their own greed. The storm was beginning to break, and in the east the first faint light of dawn was painting a line of hope on the dark horizon. The return to Dust Devil Creek was a somber procession. Elias and a wounded Deputy Miller led a pack mule loaded with the recovered gold and Abernathy's damning papers, followed by the remnants of Kane's men who were no longer outlaws, but witnesses. The town met them in stunned silence, the people gathering on the main street, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Elias didn't offer a triumphant speech. He simply walked to the center of the street, dropped the heavy sacks of gold and the leather satchel of documents in the dust, and told them the truth. He stood before the people who had known him his entire life and confessed the sins of his father. He told them of the Sandoval family, of the massacre that had been the town's true founding, and of the murder of his own wife to protect that terrible secret. His voice was quiet, raw, and unwavering. He spared no one, least of all his own family name. He laid the town's rotten foundation bare for all to see. There was no shouting, no outrage from the crowd, only a thick, heavy silence as the weight of the revelation settled over them, poisoning the myths they had built their lives upon. They were living on stolen land, their prosperity fertilized with blood. In the days that followed, the town began a painful reckoning. Elias, with Miller's official support, used the recovered gold not for himself, but to establish a restitution fund. He sought out the descendants of other families, both native and Mexican, who had been pushed off their land by Thorne and Abernathy's relentless expansion. The money was a pathetic apology for the crimes committed, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement of the debt. Deputy Miller, his arm in a sling but his spine made of steel, was officially made sheriff. He promised to lead with the integrity the town had never known. Isabella's saloon became a de facto town hall, a place where the difficult conversations about rebuilding the town's moral fabric began. The name Thorn, once a symbol of power, was now a quiet reminder of a terrible truth. Months passed. The seasons turned. The wounds on the town began to scar over, promising a cleaner, more honest future. Elias remained only long enough to see the process started. He had no place here anymore. This town was a museum of his pain, and every street corner held a ghost. On the day he was set to leave, he rode out to the small cemetery on the hill. The morning was cool and clear. He stood before Sarah's grave, the simple wooden marker, a testament to a life cut short. For 5 years he had come here and spoken to a martyr, an innocent victim of a cruel fate. Now he knew she was more than that. She was a hero, a woman who had died for the truth. He took out the silver locket. Its surface was tarnished from the fire and the journey. He didn't open it. He knew what was inside. He placed it gently on the headstone, leaving it to rest with her. It was a final letting go, not of his love for her, but of the idealized false past that had imprisoned him for so long. He was accepting the painful truth, and in doing so was finally setting them both free. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered, his voice catching. He turned to leave his horse, waiting patiently nearby, ready to carry him west toward a future he couldn't yet imagine. As he did, he saw a group of men on horseback waiting for him at the cemetery gate. They were Native Americans, tall and dignified, their faces weathered and wise. An elder dismounted and approached him. "You are Elias Thorn," the man said. It was not a question. "We are of the people who were allied with the Sandoval family. We heard what you did. You spoke the truth when a lie would have been easier. You sought justice, not vengeance. You have honored the dead." Elias could only nod, humbled. "A man with no tribe is a ghost." The elder continued, his gaze profound. "Your path here is finished. We have come to offer you a place among us, not as a warrior to fight our battles, but as a man of honor to find peace. Our home is in the mountains, a quiet place, a place to heal." Elias looked from the elder's outstretched hand to the vast open horizon. It was not the dramatic escape of a hero riding off into the sunset. It was something quieter, more profound. It was a humble, uncertain step toward a new beginning, a chance not to forget the past, but to learn to live with it. He took the elder's hand. "Thank you," he said, the 2 words carrying the weight of his entire journey. He mounted his horse and fell in alongside them, a small, quiet procession, riding away from the ghosts of Dust Devil Creek, toward the promise of a life rebuilt not on lies, but on the hard, solid ground of truth.